some people are interested in religion. That's like a lifestyle choice that's, down for
Right.
some folks, right? Like you do you,
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
But I'm into sports or whatever. And it's like, no, like everybody actually has big picture frames for thinking about what matters in the world.
Show a young person God in the thing that they love, and they are much more likely to come to love God.
Amen. Welcome to the first episode of the Making Every Class Catholic podcast. I'm Dr. Brett Sockold, and I'm thrilled to finally be able to share this with you. This podcast and community are all about equipping Catholic educators like you to approach every subject area and your entire vocation as a teacher through the lens of our Catholic faith. Each month, I'll sit down with inspiring guests, and together we'll explore how every classroom can become a place of faith, truth, and beauty. A little about me. Before I went on to study theology, my first degree was in education, and I have been working with Catholic teachers for almost 2 decades. But everything changed for me when I was asked to teach a course for prospective Catholic teachers. It was then that I first heard about curriculum permeation, the idea that every subject can and should be taught from a Catholic point of view. Exploring that idea with my students that semester was so exciting that it became first a book and now a whole ministry. We've got some amazing guests lined up, and I can't wait for you to hear from them. Today, in this very first episode, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Christopher Baglow of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, one of the leading thinkers on the question at the heart of this podcast and online community. Thank you so much for being here. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you know a fellow Catholic teacher, share this podcast with them. Let's build this community together. All right, let's get started. Ready? Let's go.
So, Brett, in this kind of intersection of Catholicism and culture, has it ever occurred to you that All Souls Day is the original Festivus for the rest of us?
It has not, but I love how literally that actually is the case.
Yes.
It is a Festivus, technically, and it's for the rest of us. It's so good. All right. Here we go. This will come out, a month after All Souls Day, but that's fine anyways. Right. Very good. Dr. Christopher Baglow, welcome to the Making Every Class Catholic podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Chris. You and I have worked together on these kinds of questions before, and it's a delight to welcome you as the first guest of this new podcast. So why don't we start by just sharing a little bit about yourself and your work, your day job, and then maybe a little how it relates to our theme for the whole podcast, Making Every Class Catholic.
Sure. So I am a faculty member, a theologian first and foremost, and a faculty member in the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And in that capacity, I also direct the Science and Religion Initiative, which is a program precisely for helping high school science and religion teachers work together to integrate the Catholic identity of a school in science classes, but also to help the religion teachers, the theology teachers, reflect positively on modern science as a way of thinking about the faith. So that's the work that I do. And I also get the opportunity, a wonderful opportunity, in fact, to teach faith and science to undergraduates and graduate students at Notre Dame on a regular basis.
I'm familiar, and some of our listeners might be familiar with some of your writing in this. You have a textbook that can be used as a textbook for a high school course. Mm-hmm. And maybe we can start with the story of where that textbook came from, because if I'm not mistaken, that was sort of your intro into this kind of work. But then since then, of course, you've expanded quite a bit beyond that. So maybe share with us a little bit of that story.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I did not get my degree or PhD in systematic theology with a concentration on the relationship between faith and science. In fact, my main area was ecclesiology and the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And 5 years into my academic career, after teaching high school through the 90s and getting my degrees, I started teaching at the college level. And in 2005, I found myself a Hurricane Katrina refugee. My wife and I and our 2 oldest children our home was flooded, and we ended up living in a rectory in central Louisiana for about 2 or 3 weeks. And in fact, we're out of our home for about a year. But it was in that context, when we were concerned that the college where I taught was not going to open again, that I was approached by the president of McGill-Tulane Catholic High School in Mobile, Alabama, Father Bry Shields. And he had this idea for creating a curriculum for his senior religion classes on the relationship between faith and science. A project that I probably would have turned down had I not been in a position where I had absolutely nothing to do but fret
Right.
and worry about when we would get back into our house or whether or not I would still have a job. So that's how I started. So I found myself proposing and then writing a curriculum on faith and science. So you were right. My first really introduction to the intersection of faith and science, and of course to Catholic academic integration, came at a very interesting moment in my life, kind of unbidden. And over time, ultimately became a serious area of research and then moonlighting, working with various schools and seminars, et cetera. And then in 2018, it became my daylighting, so to speak, at the University of Notre Dame.
So your current job at Notre Dame grew out of the work you started when you were working with this high school.
Yes, because what I did was I created the curriculum and then delivered it to the faculty over a year of professional development afternoon sessions. You know what I mean? The school would have an abbreviated schedule that day, and then I would come out there and I went through it almost chapter by chapter. And then we handed the curriculum over to the faculty, and it did not go anywhere. And it quickly became clear that the science teachers did not feel confident because they didn't know enough theology.
Right.
And the theology teachers did not feel confident because they didn't know enough science.
Right.
And so in the academic year of 2010, 2011, we put on 2 fundraisers. So it's actually like cooking a suckling pig in a Cajun microwave at the beginning of this whole journey, right? For, with an auction and that kind of thing. And we put together enough money to have a week-long seminar. The first one was held at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, the Jesuit school there. That's where the high school is also located. And along with some fellow scholars who are interested in faith and science, Steve Barr, who should be well known to everyone as one of the foremost names in the faith science dialogue in the English speaking world, and another colleague, Corey Hayes, a theologian and a philosopher, and an evolutionary psychologist, Matt Rossano, an education expert, Dr. Rebecca Maloney, and I gave basically a library of books for the participants to read, and then we spent a week discussing them.
Wow. I mean,
yes.
Let me just think for a minute. I mean, so what you highlighted at the beginning of that story is, I think, a common hurdle, which is you have people with expertise in 2 different areas. And if they want those things to talk to each other, they need at least some expertise in the other area. And that's a common, right? And when we train our teachers, a tiny handful of them are trained in like theology plus literature, theology plus history, theology plus science. And right. so you have to structure your professional development to take into account that you have experts in these 2 different domains, and they may not have a lot of fluency across those domains. And you want to get them sharing their particular expertise, but also building up each other's expertise, across that curricular divide.
Absolutely. And it became clear that in some cases, the science teachers weren't even really sure what the religion teachers were doing. The religion teachers, of course, had left their science preparation oftentimes back in their early undergraduate experience or even just in high school and hadn't had any science background. So to learn about the disciplines together created the platform for understanding and appreciating what each could bring to the discussion. And then actually thinking about and reading great works on the relationship between faith and science helped them begin to see how they could collaborate and how they could bring this up in their own classrooms. And so that was the real breakthrough. From that point forward, the school was able to use the curriculum, which was later published as a textbook, as you mentioned at the beginning. And I applied for a grant from the Templeton Foundation to do 2 more such seminars for teachers from all over the country. That grant ended in 2013, and 2014, the Institute for Church Life here at the University of Notre Dame picked up the project, and I was an outside collaborator almost from the start. And then in 2017, I was invited to apply for a position to direct the whole thing.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, let me zoom in on one other piece of this, which I think is so interesting, which is the experience of the student in a classroom where the science teacher has some theological fluency and where the religion teacher has some scientific fluency. Because my expectation, my understanding from talking to people on the ground is that most of our students experience these things as completely separate from the pop culture, but even from the way that it's presented, even in their Catholic school. They might have a very good religion curriculum and a very good science curriculum in a sense that never intersect. And so they become these separate compartments in your brain, and the culture is going to give you a sense that like you have to pick between them. Right. And so it just seems to me that if you have the staff talking across this curricular divide, that the shape of the experience of the student is going to be transformed by this.
Absolutely. And in fact, that was one of the really neat things, because it became clear to me from the very beginning that of the 2 disciplines, the one that suffers the most from this divide or this separation is religion, is theology. Because, of course, science can be done according to its method without any reference to the supernatural or God. In fact, it kind of has to be done that way, right? You're looking for natural causes, relationships, natural relationships between things.
It's weird that the theological definition of science is an abstraction from theology, right? Secondary causality works without reference to miraculous causes, it brackets things. And that's actually, it's a theological claim, or at least a philosophical one, that says we don't do that here, right? So, I mean, that's a fascinating, almost a paradox kind of a thing. But you're right in how it shakes out in the classroom, right? You could do science independently and still do a lot of good science, because that's the kind of thing science is, right?
But when you try to do theology without reference to science, what you're doing is you're essentially subtracting the kind of powerful explanatory work that science does and the way it informs the way we see the world. And if you stand before an audience today and you hold up your car keys and you let them go and they fall to the ground and you ask them why they did, they're all going to say gravity.
Right.
I know, because I do this all the time. And you're going to ask them whose theory of gravity, and they're all going to say Newton, and they're entirely right. And what I point out then is that just the way that you've become habituated to seeing the world according to Newton's theory of gravity, young people are now beginning to see the world in terms of cosmic and biological evolution, in terms of a cosmos that's billions of years old. If you're not going to talk about that in relationship to the faith, you're missing an incredible opportunity. Right. Yes.
So, okay, let me play with a couple ideas. The first is there's this weird asymmetry where, in a certain sense, science abstracts from theological categories, and it has to be science. But theology requires, I mean, we have revelation, and theology is the study of revelation. But there's a category of revelation, which you might call natural revelation, or the book of nature, right? Where it's not supernatural revelation, that is rightly informative of theology. So there's a way in which science does without theology, but theology doesn't do without science. But I also want to, I don't want to leave it hanging there, because I want to say doing science is not the same thing as thinking about science. And so you can do science without theology, and you should, in a way. But when you think about what you're doing when you do science, then theology all of a sudden has a proper role. And if it doesn't have its proper role, you're actually going to think about science for the worse. You're going to do it more poorly than you could have, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because science it begs the question, the method begs the questions of why one would do it in the first place, why one would expect it to be successful,
Right.
right? Those questions are questions that you need philosophy and theology to answer.
Right. Right.
Um, or you're just going to say, well, it just is,
Right.
right? It just is.
Yeah.
And I guess you can do it that way, right? But it certainly ceases to, uh, it loses some of its
Right.
wonder
Well, there's something
and some,
about the
yeah,
curiosity that should inform the scientific method, that to
sure,
abandon that curiosity as soon as you get outside the realm of the material, right? And as soon as you're not
right,
studying the material order, now you're not a curious person anymore. There's some like
yeah,
weird cognitive dissonance going on
right,
there, right?
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. When I
So
Go
it,
ahead.
yeah, go ahead. Oh no, you
I
go
was
ahead.
just gonna say, when I work with teachers on this, one of the first objections that you need to, it's a legit question and you need to tackle it head on, is like, are you going to ask me to do theology in my science classroom? And you want to say like,
Mm,
each subject has its right science, but not only science. Every subject has its rightful methodological independence. And the way I put that
yes,
in like layman's terms is like, science questions deserve science answers, but there are
yes,
questions about science that are not science questions. And when you frame
yes,
it
that's
that
right.
way, they're like, oh, yeah, I can have questions in a Catholic science class about where does science come from? Why does science matter? How do we use science well? Those are all questions about science that rightly belong
Yes,
in a science class, but they're different kinds of questions than how does photosynthesis work?
exactly. Yeah, and I think that that's a great. I think you put it really well there. Then, if the class is open to this wider wisdom, as I like to call it, right, of theology and philosophy, it doesn't suffer. It's not being displaced by it. It's being given its place by it.
Oh, I like that. The mistake is to imagine they're in some kind of zero sum game. So I have X number
Yes,
of hours, and if I take those hours away from science and give them to theology, then I'm reduced in what I can do in science. And when you start doing
right.
it well, what you realize is you're coming with some framework or other. And being intentional
Yes,
and building a good framework actually enhances the way you can do science. It's not in some zero sum competition for your time or your energy.
right. John Paul II put it pithily and beautifully when he said, "Science can purify religion from error and superstition, and religion can purify science from idolatry and false
Right.
absolutes." That's a wonderful way of putting the relationship. If you're not going to talk about science in a religion class, right, then what you say will seem outdated, primitive, superstitious, right? Because you can't see the relationship between, say, the biblical creation account and Big Bang cosmology or those kind
Right.
of things. If you're not going to make those explicit, you're missing a great opportunity to show the harmony between them.
Right.
In much the same way, if you just simply act as if only science can show us the truth, then you are making science almost an
Right.
idol,
And you're
right?
making a
Yeah.
non-scientific claim. Right? The idea
Yes,
that only science
exactly.
can show us the truth is not something anyone could prove in a lab in an experiment. So you like you've cut
Exactly.
yourself, you've cut off the branch you're sitting on. Um,
Yeah.
so
And that's the thing is that almost not offering the frame,
is offering a frame just a bad one?
wrong frame.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Chris, you and I could talk about science for the next half hour, I'm sure. Um,
Yeah.
and let's point out, there's your materials on science are all over the internet, and people can certainly go looking for those, and we can put some of those in the show notes. But let's zoom out a little bit and think about how we approach what is sometimes called Catholic academic integration. I know your colleague Claire Kilbane at the McGrath Institute
Yes.
often uses that term. And how does it apply more generally to other subjects? Science is a great example to walk through. And just yourself, you have since expanded. You started thinking about this mostly in terms of science, but you have also written
Mhm.
and started thinking about how it applies in other subjects. So what if we started with a question like, what is Catholic academic integration? What does it mean to approach every subject from a Catholic point of view?
Sure. Well, the church defines it well, I think, in Educating Together in Catholic Schools, where it says that Catholic education, or a Catholic school, that's the way they put it, should be a synthesis of faith and culture, reached by integrating all of human knowledge through the subjects taught in the light of the gospel. That's such a rich definition. There's so much that can be said about it, right? In fact, in my article on it, I try to do a little bit of that, breaking down each part of that definition and looking at all of the implications and ramifications that it might have. So the key here is what it means to look at something in the light of the gospel. And I think it's important to emphasize that the light of the gospel is not a light that deforms what we see. It's not a glare that makes it impossible to look at the objects of our vision, be it history or literature or art. Instead, it becomes something that illumines those things and allows us to see elements of them we would not see were we not to engage it from that perspective. I think that is really, that's the best way of thinking of Catholic academic integration.
Right. So a common thing that I encounter is people's first, where their imagination goes first. When you say teach everything from a Catholic point of view, they imagine adding Catholic stuff, right? And like that's pretty easy to do in like music or art, literature, foreign languages. There's no shortage of Catholic content. You could do almost exclusively Catholic content and never run out. But then if that's the approach, then they say, well, I don't understand how you do it in science, except maybe, well, you address some controversial issues like evolution or that kind of thing. But then they say like, but you just can't do it in math. Right. Unless you do like these super awkward word problems. Like I was in Montana the other day and they were like, there's two nuns driving to Saskatchewan and they're going, 80 miles an hour. That's the speed limit in Montana. Right. And everyone gets a good chuckle. And it's funny, but it's funny also because we all know that if that's how you teach math in a Catholic school, there's something that feels artificial there and might even start building resentment in your audience. So what you said about approaching in every subject in the light of the gospel, what might that look like in something like math?
Yeah. Well, that's a tough subject for me. My father, who was converted to Catholicism when I was 18, got his degree in math at Brown University, an Ivy League school. And my wonderful, long-suffering dad would sit with me for hours when I would try to figure out geometry or algebra. I never even made it to calculus, right? It's just one of those subjects that I'm probably not the best person to ask about because I don't understand math well enough. But I do think that the reality of numbers, the fact that we can think about the relationship between these things, that they can hold without even reference to the material world, tells us something about the human mind, the human spirit, the human intellect, right? So there's a kind of anthropological truth that the faith teaches us that math shows quite well and splendidly.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Let's play with this. So humans do math. We don't know anything else that does math. And what we're doing when we're doing math is some kind of abstraction from the physical world into a purely spiritual, like you can't put a number in your pocket, right? And so to be able to engage in an activity like that says that you are a unique kind of creature. You're a material creature. You encounter trees and mushrooms and gravity and whatever, the way all physical creatures do. But you're also a spiritual creature because you abstract from that physical experience of reality into something like number or equation. And then you do stuff with it. You weirdo. Like it's
all right. And some of it turns out to be eerily applicable to the natural world.
Right.
Stephen Barr, who is a man who I once saw overcome frustration with a speaker by writing out the most unusual mathematical formulas ever seen scribbling on a pad of paper next to me. He goes, "This is what I do when I'm getting so frustrated and I don't want to say anything out loud." He has actually shown how the deep mathematical elegance of the laws of nature that undergird
Right.
everything are even more beautiful than the phenomena they describe, right? Most students of math are not even going to get to the point where they're going to be thinking about the equations of superstring theory. But wouldn't it be good for them to know that so many things are actual systems of mathematics have been developed without anyone thinking that they had any relevance to the natural world, only to discover that they were needed to describe it.
Right. Right. So it's a cause of wonder that it works. I mean that's a philosophical question. It's not a mathematical question. The correspondence between math and material reality is a philosophical rather than a mathematical question. And from a theological point of view, it's something about the doctrine of creation. And then you look at the fact that humans are the ones doing it, and you say, okay, so there's the doctrine of creation that talks about the material order, and then there's the creation of the human person, this sort of steward put in the garden that has a particular role here. And one of the things they use to exercise that role is this abstraction from physical reality that we call math, that somehow ends up describing things like how atoms spin. We didn't know about atoms when we first came up with math, but somehow there's this correspondence there, right?
Yeah, and I think that no one would be or a mathematician would miss a great opportunity, a math teacher, if they didn't look at some of the greatest mathematical masterpieces of the Christian tradition, and I'm thinking specifically about the Gothic cathedrals.
Okay.
Yeah, I have it's a video actually that I did for Word on Fire called "The Window on Salvation: Mathematics and the Mystery of the Incarnation," in which I show how the North Rose window of Chartres uses the Fibonacci spiral in order to teach us something about God entering the world through the corrupt lineage of the Davidic kings of all
Okay.
things. Yeah, so that's a Church Life Journal article, but it's also a video, so it could be used in the classroom as either. Uh, I did that shortly after my dad passed away in honor of him, and I hope that he was smiling when he when I finished it, because he could have told everyone this guy should not be writing about math.
Right,
But anyway,
right. But that
yeah,
the idea that someone might use the beauty of math to approach the divine is like this is a pre-Christian, like Pythagoras thought that, right? Like people hear, everyone knows the Pythagorean theorem because you learn it in whatever grade 6 or 7 or whatever it is, right? So but people don't know that Pythagoras like had thought philosophically about the reality of number and its relation to divinity and all this kind of stuff, right? So the whole history of math is actually littered with this sort of spiritual ascent, or this attempts at integrating these kinds of things, because the beauty and order of it speaks to something in the human person that is more than like, where will I get my next meal? Can I pay my mortgage? Like the strictly material concerns, math seems to appeal to something in the higher person. And then we map it onto something like a spiritual quest. And Pythagoras is the first instance of that I know of in history, but there may well have been some before, and there have been plenty since. So doing a rose window with the Fibonacci sequence isn't a one-off. Like that's actually what humans do, right? Yeah,
right,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
exactly. And I mean, the architects of those cathedrals, I mean, they would argue about which ratios were the most divine,
right, right.
and then they would use them to build those amazing buildings, right? So there's a great
Right. And
example.
I'm not an expert in this at all, but my understanding is people have done similar things in music theory, right? Because music theory is about ratios, right? Between, how many vibrations in this note and how many vibrations in this note, and then together they make this chord, and, those kinds of things, right? And some of them sound good together and some of them don't. And the human mind is going to be like, well, that must mean something. Like we will not be
Yes,
content to say that this is a cosmic accident.
right, exactly. No, yeah, we look at it, because we have minds, we kind of instinctively, interesting, ironically, recognize mind.
Right. Right. Like recognizes
Yeah.
like. Yeah.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
we're all part of a big cosmic joke. Like
Yes. That's right.
that's your other alternative, right?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So okay, well let's grab one or two other subjects that you've started thinking about. So we've talked about
Yes.
math and science, and that's great because that's often where people's like first hurdle is. And they want to think about math and science. But what are one or two other subjects that you've done some thinking about and how they might relate to this question of approaching every subject in the light of the gospel?
Literature and history, I think, are essential in this regard. I think that, um, and my hope that, because I mean, I think good progress has been made in education regarding faith and science. It continues to go on. But I do think that the kind of discourse really needs to go to those areas. First of all, history. Let's talk about that, right? The church's approach to history is very much like her approach to science. Use good methods of historiography, right? Even reading the Bible, use those good methods of historiography, right? But then at the same time, approach this in such a way that you can also see how we can learn for a better future, right? From the glorious examples that we find in the church's history, but then also from those sad examples that John Paul II highlighted as he led the church on that purification of memory, now seems so long ago, at the end of the second millennium, right? Um, Learning how we can live a better and more fully Christian future precisely by learning from the greatness of the past, but also from its
Right,
shadows.
right.
Yeah, it's kind of like what the Ignatian examen is for an individual. That's what history is for a Catholic high school curriculum. You see God's action in the past, you thank Him for it. You also see those places where, in your day, say in an individual examen, where you strayed from that, right? And then you pray for the graces that you need for tomorrow. Well, that's a nice way of kind of thinking about what a history uh, curriculum can do for a young mind in a high school,
Right.
a Catholic high school.
Okay, this is interesting. So one of the questions in history is what counts as history? Right? Because a lot of things happen that we're never going to talk about or hear about. And we can't like we there's just so much noise. How do you dial in and find the frequency? And I think part of what you've just given us is like a rubric by which to decide what gets studied. Now it's not a completely fleshed out, but I think it's a basic insight. And I think it's worth noticing that history is not just like all the things. In a certain sense, it is, but that's not comprehensible, right? And so then you need like organizing principles around your study, and those will not be value neutral, right? And so just like history might seem neutral in the way that math is, like it's just the stuff that happened. Okay, well, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, that's not how we humans are going to approach it. We're going to approach it with priorities, lenses, ways of differentiating what's worth our time and what's not. And what you just articulated is like a Catholic approach to history will have these priorities, will focus on these kinds of things, right? And I just think it's worth noticing that that's what we're doing, and you don't get to not do that. If we don't use your framework, we're using some framework, and that framework might be distorting or clarifying, but it's history is not just all the stuff.
Right. This might be a good place to mention, especially in the in the U.S. context, or the fact that a lot of history curricula, textbooks, etc., are kind of state sponsored.
Right.
Right
Right.
now, now that doesn't mean that they can't be used and even used very, very well. But you may find some places where that's in friction with or in tension with a Catholic approach. And what a better way to learn the Catholic approach in a way that's going to be fruitful for the rest of your life
Right.
than to see those areas of tension and friction, right?
Right.
Yeah,
To notice that whoever wrote this textbook wrote it with a set of priorities. They couldn't help themselves. That's going to happen. And the way those may lead to outright falsehood, but it may just be a difference of framing that highlights this or doesn't highlight that. I mean, we know this line, right? History is written by the victors. Now, that's not meant as a compliment.
No,
That's a
no, no, no.
recognition that the stories are told with um, some sense of why they're being told. It's maybe some kind of justification, right? And I like to think one of
Absolutely.
the things that informs what you described as the framework you put for history that includes our glories but also our failures is scripture. I mean, like, scripture is a really strange document. If you think, okay, like the world has produced, a whole bunch of ancient sacred texts and all this kind of stuff. Okay, yeah, and mythologies and whatever else. Great. Um, I'm not an expert in every text in the ancient world, but from what I can tell, scripture is pretty unique in the way that it like does not um, make apologies for the mistakes of its heroes, right? Like David
No.
makes David is held up as this like he made terrible decisions, right?
Yes.
And this is part of Israel's story. They look unflinchingly at the failings of their leadership. And there's this like anti-king narrative in a book about kings, right? I mean, it's a very,
Yeah.
it's and it's what modern people might call like history from the grassroots or something to that effect, right? It's it's not the propaganda of the rich and the powerful who get to tell stories that justify keeping them rich and powerful. And so there's something in the biblical narrative that shapes history, the Western concept of history, as like it's not real if it's just the powerful justifying their power. Right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the way that you've described it um, gets right at the issue here. Everybody is going to approach history looking for meaning,
Right.
right? And if you were looking unself consciously and unself critically, right, you are going to look for those things that you've already bought. You're not going to be challenged by it to think, you know what I mean, to think differently about 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 yourself, about the world. Um, Herbert McCabe, the great Catholic Dominican Thomist, um, he once wrote that the human animal is the animal that, in principle, has an autobiography.
Nice.
I think that's very interesting, right? What is an autobiography? An autobiography is when a person looks at their life and asks questions of meaning about it, even if they have to throw up their hands at some aspects and say, I don't know what this means, right? Or even if they have to say in humility, this was a mistake, right? This was a mistake. This was a sin, right? Human beings can do that with themselves. And so we can begin to do that with history, right? And that, I think, is what can really make history powerful for shaping a Catholic mind and a Catholic heart.
So just as we noticed with math that humans are the ones doing it, it's this
Yes.
we're following the same pattern here, right? The fact that humans are the ones doing history tells you something about history and tells you something about humans, right? I watched this really interesting documentary on, I think it was Netflix, called Chimp Empire. Have you ever heard of this Chimp Empire?
No, I haven't.
So it's a story of this band of chimpanzees in tribal warfare with the neighboring bands, and there's relationships, and there's they're growing up and they're mating, and there's raiding parties and all this kind of stuff, and it's told like history, right? It's told like the chimps are very humanized, and there's some incredibly powerful moments. There's this moment that is so sometimes the higher primates, they feel like you're looking in a mirror, right? And so there's this
Yeah, right.
instance where the leader was fatally injured in a battle with the neighbors, and he goes off and finds a place to die quietly, and he disappears and he's led the troop for 7 or 8 years, and his friend goes and finds him and holds his hand while he dies, and you just think like, what like what is going on, uh and then you have to realize that as impressive as that is, and as human as that looks, the whole framing of this as a history is being done by the humans and not by the chimps.
That's right.
And the
That's
chimps have
right.
been doing this for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, and they don't tell the
Yep.
story of it, and they don't make sense of it in the narrative arc the way we do, even if at certain points they look almost indistinguishable from us. Like they do
Yes,
things
absolutely.
that blow your mind, and then you have to
Yeah.
zoom out and like, but they're not filming us. Right?
Mhm. Right, 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 yeah. Exactly, because we're continuously asking questions of meaning. We wanna know why, and we wanna understand, and when we see something as powerful as what you described in a chimp, we can then say, "Wow, how much they are like us," which, by the way, I think is why, the whole story of human evolution is an interesting thing to talk about, because what we're seeing in those chimps, our closest living evolutionary relatives, is part of the rich trove of what we draw from as humans, right? The emotions that they have, those kinds of things. But in a sense, we can say that the emotions have them, right? We, though, can make those our own in a way that they can't. And we can be moved by them even when we see them in other animals.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a kind of like there's a conductor at the wheel, I like, and you can have a certain kind of control over your emotions by shaping your thoughts, for instance, right? You maybe you can't control your emotions directly, but you can like second order control your emotion, right? Like that's like what cognitive behavioral therapy is in a sense, right? um and so there's this relationship with our emotions, which are animal in a sense, but
Uh-huh.
also spiritual in another sense, right? And that's the battle inside of us. And when I watch baboons like capturing like wives from one another's harems, I'm like, that looks eerily similar and also not.
Emphasis of faith and yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. uh,
Yes, yeah. And human beings can certainly live and act in that
right,
way.
right. And yeah, and when you see it, it looks creepy because it looks familiar.
Yes,
Yes,
right.
right. And so
Mhm.
there's a kind of a mirror there, but then there's the reflection on like, well, a baboon would never think that looked creepy. So what's going on in me that I can recognize it, and at the same time as I recognize it, have a critical distance from it, that's a particularly human thing, right? Okay, this is a problem. You and I could do this for every single subject. So
I
you
know.
mentioned literature, let's do literature, and then we'll move on to a few more like, we're theologians, we love the theory, right? So
Right.
then let's do literature, and then let's dive a little bit into practice, which is some of the stuff you talked
Okay,
about earlier, the way you did the professional development, for example. That was more to some practical
sure.
questions. So but let's do literature first.
I think that literature is could very well be the most important of all the subjects in terms of integrating faith and the other disciplines, precisely because it is literature that most powerfully shapes the imagination. And that, I think, is one of the great opportunities that, at least from my perspective, is too often missed in Catholic education, to think intentionally about the opportunities that studying great literature provides. Um, Recently, I had got to hear two excellent presentations on this, both at events that we have. We do about 15 professional development events as part of our grant every year. And we bring in other disciplines because we can't just talk about faith and science at a high school that has you know what I mean, a faculty that has other questions in other areas. One of them was by Justin Petrizik, who's here at Notre Dame, the De Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture. He gave a talk called Reading Sensibly, and it was basically about how one can use the senses of scripture as a way of reading literature. Okay, you can look at the various levels, right? The literal sense, the analogical sense, the moral sense, the anagogical sense, and look at a piece of great literature and find the various ways in which it can be read at those levels. One cool thing that we talked about is how certain kinds of literature, which oftentimes show up in Catholic schools, can actually show us through their lack of some of those elements. Like you're not going to find the anagogical sense very deeply in something like The Catcher in the Rye.
So for those of us who need to hear the definitions of the terms, the anagogical sense is
It is. Well, let me go from the
Okay.
beginning. The literal sense is the meaning of the words.
Right.
The analogical sense is the meaning of the people and events and the way that they point to even deeper realities. The moral sense is what kind of moral exemplarity or the lack thereof do we find in the various characters in the story? How can we learn from their great deeds? How can we learn from their misdeeds, etc.? And the anagogical is something that points to our eternal destiny. Now, that's how we apply it to scripture, right? Yeah. So, how could we read ways in which, or how can we read in such a way that we can even see some of those levels in the various stories that we look
Right,
at?
right. Okay, I'm thinking, so this is interesting. I know that lots of people, like, they get to college, for instance, maybe high school, but maybe college, and they're exposed to something like Camus, or something, right? And you read a story, and then when you're done, you're like, that's not a story.
Yeah.
Right. And based on what you just said, I think something of what's going on there is like, we're made for stories in a certain sense, and we look for different layers of meaning within them, whether that's scripture or a fairy tale or whatever it is, in order to make sense, because we use them to make sense of ourselves and figure out where we belong in the world and what our life is all about. And if a certain style of literature develops in the 20th century, let's say, that explicitly renounces that role, I will write a story that will not tell you who you are and where you belong in the world and what life is all about. And it's doing that so it's intentionally, it's not accidentally not having the anagogical. It's intend because if you were unintentional, you'd slip it in somewhere. You, in fact, you intentionally abstract from this thing because you say, I'm not interested in that, and or that's not really a thing. And so I'm going to tell you a story that's going to put you really ill at ease. And then the reader can say, I'm really ill at ease, and maybe I just need to grow up and get past fairy stories and realize that, nihilism is actually the right response to my experience in the world. Or, but the natural response is like, that's not really a story. I feel ripped off. What happened to me here, right?
Right.
I think
Right.
if you explore the four senses that you said in a Catholic high school, not just by studying scripture, but by studying Steinbeck, or whatever it is, people will learn something about themselves and their relationship with story, and how that shapes our life or doesn't, how different people might tell different stories that are designed to shape that world, or maybe in a positive way, maybe in a manipulative and coercive way, maybe in an exploratory way. But you'll have all these categories for recognizing what's actually going on with me in my encounter
Right.
with a story.
Sure. And you can put yourself in a situation where you read something like the Exodus narrative, right? The crossing of the Red Sea or something like that. Even if you're not going to be reading it deeply in a literature class, and show them the various levels of meaning, teaching them how to apply this also beyond scripture. I mean, you're killing two or three birds with one stone right there, right?
And then you can watch The
Uh,
Dark Knight,
yeah, right. You're
because
right.
the
Exactly.
one genre that does not
Yes,
dispense with these things is comic books. Comic books will play to what humans want from a story, right? Which is why
absolutely.
there's a resurrection in like every second superhero movie.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So, I mean, one thing I do with my classes, and I, by the way, do this in my faith and science class, but I also go into it even more deeply when I teach foundations of theology at Notre Dame, which I do pretty regularly too, is I give them A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. And I make them look at the various things, like the grandmother dead, staring at the sky with a smile on her face, right? And her eyes full of the sky. What is that telling you about what she's experienced and what she's done in the end, right? Um, yeah, that turns a story that most people read and think, oh my gosh, this could not possibly be a Catholic woman. She's
Right,
deranged,
right,
right? Into a, oh no, this deeply tells me about the meaning of life and the world and what it means to reach beyond myself. Those kinds of opportunities. And it can be done when you have a proper proportion of literature, both Catholic, non-Catholic, as long as it's great literature, as long as it's not what I call prescription fiction, which is just, something basically that you should buy in a, off a dime store shelf. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's ABC after school special kind of
Right.
book.
With
Yeah.
our kids, we treat literature like food. So there's like super
Yeah.
healthy food, and that's what you
Yes.
mostly do. And then there's like dessert
Yeah.
and snacks, which is okay once in a while. And then there's
Right.
poison, and you should never eat it. Right.
Right. Exactly. Yes. You got it. I mean, that's a great way of thinking
Yeah.
about it.
So okay, we could do this for a long time, but let's think. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, okay, we can do this. We can do this in every subject, and we've seen some examples of how to do that I hope are helpful for our listeners. Let's think about the mission of Catholic education, right? So what are we trying to do in Catholic schools? What's our big picture? And how does this practice of approaching every subject from a Catholic point of view, how does that relate to our big picture goals? What are we all about, and what does this have to do with that?
Sure. Well, we don't do anything, we humans, until we make up our mind about them. And the more that we do things and the more we do, the more our ability to think accurately about things is sharpened. And I think that's what this does. I mean, just let's go back through it. Understanding the natural world as creation is where we started. Seeing how mathematics strangely shows us something absolutely unique about ourselves, but then at the same time, all of a sudden has an applicability to reality, right? God has made everything according to measure, number, and weight, according to the Book of Wisdom, right? History, the great adventure of human life and its successes and its tragedies and where these come from and how they resonate with my own life and the way in which I live it and the way in which I contribute to that great story that is human history. And literature, which shows me by its presence and sometimes by its glaring absence, various levels of reality. As my daughter recently put in a talk she gave called "Reading Widely and Wisely in Catholic Education," sacramentality and moral exemplarity and beauty, right? When you put all of that together, you're creating a human being that is, in fact, capable of great thoughts and then great things. And I think that that's what it does. That's what it does.
Right. I mean, one of the beautiful things is each of the individual subjects that we discussed, and we could have discussed 10 more, is a lens onto reality, but they show you the same reality. They're not disconnected sets of skills or information that you may or may not use in the job market or in some practical application in your own life. I mean, three cheers for practical applications and good jobs. I'm not opposed to them.
Absolutely.
But what we're
Yes.
seeing here is not an education that is primarily oriented towards those things. Seek the higher good, and those other goods, they'll come along. You don't have to worry about them, right? They're not in competition. But what you see instead is this like rich sense of the human person before God in creation and how you make sense of yourself. And I think, like, it seems to me that's our job. And then, and I think you said this somewhere once. If we do this in every subject, all our students, they have different gifts, different talents, different interests. If you're a phys ed gal, or if you're a math guy, or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you think, well, that's the thing that's really important, that's what's interesting about the world to me, that's where I want to spend my life and my attention, then if each of those individual things is seen within the light of faith, then that thing which is rightly seen as good and valuable by the student is then integrated into a Christian worldview instead of being like an option. Right? Oh, I'm interested in, some people are interested in religion. That's like a lifestyle choice that's, down for
Right.
some folks, right? Like, you do you, whatever.
Sure.
But I'm into sports or whatever. And it's like, no, like, everybody actually has big picture frames for thinking about what matters in the world.
Show a young person God in the thing that they love, and they are much more likely to come to love God.
Amen.
It's as simple as
Quick
that.
note to the editor. That's the opening monologue. That we're grabbing that clip. That's Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant. I mean, that could be the sort of epitaph for the thing, right?
And they may find out that they love things they didn't know or ever think they could.
That's an
And
interesting
that's fantastic too.
That's an
Yeah.
interesting inverse of it. And I've had this happen. So
Right.
when I talk about math with Catholic teachers, very often the
Yeah.
math teachers are like, "Hey, that's awesome." But one of the really interesting things is religion or literature teachers will come up to me and say, "I always hated math, but that sounded super interesting."
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
if they had conceived of math as like a skill that some people need to do certain jobs, well, good. Let the
Right.
engineers and the accountants do that, and I will happily ignore them. Right?
Yeah. And that's in our own, like someone might ask, why don't you just talk about the why evolution and faith go together, which we do. You know what I mean? Why the Galileo affair is not what most people think it was, which we do. We also have labs in our week-long seminars for science teachers and religion teachers, so that the religion teachers can watch the scientists at work. Because it's very, very important that both the religion teacher and the science teacher, for that matter, the history teacher, the literature teacher, that they come to love or at least deeply respect the other subject as much as they're capable of doing.
Right.
And when that happens, you're already halfway there.
Right. Right. Well, there's a chapter in my book. I'm not sure that it's original to me. I might have heard this from somewhere else. It's one of those things that you might have plagiarized, but you never know because it
Yeah.
burrows in your head, right? And it's called Catholicism Makes Everything Interesting. And I think like what you're just describing there is, and I think a Catholic education should do that in general, right? Like this thing, which looks like it might have no connection with you because you're interested in other kinds of things. You're an art person, not a math person, or vice versa, whatever it is. It's like, hold on. Actually, like the whole world is interesting. And you are built in such a way, actually, to find satisfaction in all the good things. Right? Like, I
Yes,
mean, you could
absolutely.
almost conceive of like one of the this is a little off the map, but like if purgatory, part of it is like, okay, getting over the brokenness, right? But I almost feel like if you know the story Leaf by Niggle, that purgatory moves from like this sort of drudgery to this other phase, which is just like acclimatizing yourself to the good. And I almost feel like, okay, yeah, you got to work through your sin and your broken relationships and all this other kind of stuff. But then you actually have to learn to appreciate the good things that you didn't appreciate. Like that's like
That's right.
heaven won't be heaven if you don't think great literature is great. If you
Right.
can't enjoy math, you're not there yet. Like that's like all the good
Right.
things. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Which is why I'll live through about 2 or 3,000 years of operas
Until you can
in
appreciate
purgatory.
opera. My,
Yeah, so I can
my
appreciate
wife
them.
is an opera
My
singer.
wife loves them, and I'll go with her, and for me, it just all sounds like screeching.
Right.
So
Right, right. Yeah, no, we're all
yeah,
gonna have to learn to appreciate all of the good, right?
yeah, all of the
Yeah,
good,
yeah. No, I think
absolutely.
that's wonderful. And to think of education, actually, I heard of I think it was a chaplain at a Catholic university who said like, my job is to teach these young people to love good things, and I was like, that's
Yes,
awesome. What a
that's
great
right,
job description. Um,
absolutely. Yeah,
let's spend a little bit of time on some practical things. Now, you've talked about practical things in terms of teacher formation, right? So, how do we train teachers to do that? I think that's a super important question. Do you have any thoughts? Let's move to another level of practical. Do you have thoughts for teachers who are thinking, like, hey, I got to make a lesson plan for next week? Uh, and
right.
I'd like to be able to approach it from a Catholic point of view, and I don't even know where to start. Like, what do you got for me?
Sure. One of the things that we've done for our program is develop lesson plans. So some of the teachers that have come through our program and have come back and ultimately have begun working with it in their classrooms have now become really excellent at it. And so they've put together lesson units that can be used in various subjects. And it's really helpful that they do that because they understand better than I what's possible in a biology class or a physics class or an AP history class, that kind of thing, right? Our stuff is all in science because that's what our funding is for. But if anybody ever wants to look at that, McGrath.nd.edu /SRI is where all of our lesson plans are kept. And we'll be adding a couple more this year and a couple more in coming years each year. So we have about 8 there now.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, so one key thing is to see it done. To see, right? And nobody can make all the lesson plans that everybody needs. And in fact, it's not desirable because you actually want people to take ownership. But in order to get to that stage, to be able to see concrete examples of things that you might not have
Right.
thought of, a lesson plan that you're like,
Yeah.
I don't know how you'd teach that from a Catholic point of view. And then here it is. Here,
Right.
I heard of one. I don't know if it's in the list that you just gave, but it's something else at McGrath. And it was like a math and like social studies unit on like China's one child policy.
Yeah, that's from the Office of Life and Human
Right.
Dignity. Excellent lesson plan.
People don't even think of that. And then you see it and you're like, oh, yeah, that is math and social studies. And theology, when you get down to
Right,
it.
exactly. Yeah, so we have one on humans and race. So, of course, we know the church is teaching on racism, right? But this is it's basically a genetics, so something that's covered in biology,
Right.
a genetics lesson on why race is not a defining factor within our humanity, right? Why it's not a meaningful biological category.
Oh, that's fascinating. I just saw something the other day that it was like a checklist. Like you're joining this thing, and it's like, are you Pacific Islander or Indigenous North American or whatever? It was all these things in great detail, and with parentheses and descriptions of possible places you might have come from, and all this kind of stuff. And then there was one category that didn't look like any of the others, and it was
Mhm.
white. And
Yeah.
and I was like, okay, so that's actually, now we're not doing biology, we're doing philosophy. And we're
Yes,
doing
right,
it really
right.
poorly, right? Because what kind of a thing is this category that's not like any of the other categories anyways? Like what actually, right?
Right, exactly.
It's not European descent and then parentheses that say, Scandinavia or the British Isles or like that would have been analogous to what some of the other checklists look like. It was just white. And I was reminded that like in the history of immigration, for instance, in the United States, certain Mediterranean peoples, like Italians, were not considered white at one point in
Yes,
American
right.
history. And now everyone just sort of straightforwardly assumes they are, mostly because now they live in the suburbs and not in the inner city. But when they lived in the inner city, they weren't white. Like, so this is a social category, not a biological category, right? And to just even notice that that's a thing. Yeah. Anyways, I could go on.
It's quite wonderful because you've got to teach
Right.
genetics. So here's a way of applying it to something where there are terrible misunderstandings, prejudices, etc., that need to be challenged if we're going to take the church's approach to the human person. So yeah, so those are the kind of things. I do think that, and I know more about what a religion or theology teacher will do than others because that's what I am, right? But I do think that having, like one thing I do in Foundations of Theology, the major assignment is called the Catholicism and assignment. And there are various categories: Catholicism and film, Catholicism and the literary arts, Catholicism and the visual arts, Catholicism and history, Catholicism and science. And basically giving the students some things to do and reflect upon in light of what they're learning in the theology class. So already now you can have this kind of bridge outward from the theology class towards the other disciplines, and in a way that brings to bear what they're learning in theology on what they're learning in the other
Right.
classes.
I heard a super cool hack. It was a phys ed teacher from Chicago, middle school phys ed teacher. And he said, what I'm going to do to prepare myself for this is I'm going to read the religion curriculum that my grade 6 students are studying alongside. So like this week they studied whatever topic, right? And I'm going to know what they're studying in a given time so that when a natural connection serendipitously appears, I know what they're studying and thinking about. And then I'm prepared. I don't even necessarily need a lesson plan. that bring,
Yes.
now those are good too, but in addition, I'm just going to know what they're thinking and talking about in religion class, so when there's obvious points of connection, we can just have that conversation. And I thought, like, what a brilliant hack, you know?
Yes. It may be a great project and perhaps a book to have something, and maybe it would be better for it not to be a book because editions change from the various textbooks. But to map connections, say if you're using this book for sophomores and teaching, scripture at the same time, here are some places where you're going to be touching each other at some point or other. Not perhaps at exactly the same week, but certainly somewhere along the semester or in the academic year, and then develop opportunities that are there. I think that would be a great way of
Right.
approaching
Even a
this.
staff retreat at the beginning of the year, when you're
Oh
doing your
yeah,
long range planning, and say, like, hey, like, Galileo's coming up in February in my class. Can we work together? Right? Or whatever it happens to be, right? I think the long range planning can really, you can get some great opportunities for that kind of thing.
yeah. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think a generation of educators could be working on this, and it'll always need to be updated for various reasons, But at the same time, I do think we're on a great frontier here. And it's certainly one that, at least I've found with my work with science and religion teachers, becomes more and more exciting the more familiar they become with it.
Well, allow me to make a shameless plug then, because this podcast is housed within an online community for Catholic teachers, and I think what we've just discussed is an ideal activity for us to do together in that community,
Yes.
right? And there's going to be different, channels or rooms for specialists in different subject areas, and possibilities for collaboration and sharing resources. There's going to be content like what we're producing here today. There's going to be all that kind of stuff. But I think exactly what you're describing, and the conversations across the curricular boundaries that implies, and the sort of, the bouncing ideas off each other. Because a lot of people doing this work might feel like they're in a bit of a silo.
Yes.
And so the opportunity to collaborate, I think, is something I really hope for within that community. So
Right.
allow me to make a little plug. And what we're going to do, we're going to sign off here with you by asking you where people can find you. But if you are a member, and this will all be available wherever people get their podcasts for free and on YouTube. But if you're a member of the community, there's going to be a longer version of this available within the community, where the community can ask the guest questions. And so we have a couple questions here from members of the community that we're gonna do after we wrap here, that will be available within the community. So if you'd like to be part of that, which includes many things, including being able to submit your questions to guests that we're going to have on the podcast, please go to makingeveryclasscatholic.com and you can sign up there. But let's wrap here, Chris. And we got to have you back, because you and I think, could just do this for hours and hours and hours.
Absolutely. This has been
Yeah,
fun.
it's so stimulating for me. I'm probably the sound engineer is like, Brett, you get excited and you talk too loud into the microphone. But but let's finish with telling people where they can find you, your work,
Absolutely.
and in particular the work you have grant money for to go work in
50%
schools.
and 50%.
How do people inquire about that possibility?
Absolutely. So my email address is cbaglow@nd.edu. If anybody wants to contact me about the work that we do, our grant is called Integrating Faith and Science in Catholic High Schools Nationwide, funded by the John Templeton Foundation. 50% and 50% by the McGrath Institute for Church Life, which is our happy home. And we do 15 for each grant period, so 5 every year, faith and reason days, where we actually go out to schools and work with their faculty for day-long events. And we do faith and science stuff, of course, but we also include literature and faith, athletics and Christian formation, and those various kinds of things, because we want to make it something that every faculty member can come away enriched by. And then we do week-long seminars for science and religion teachers and administrators. And that's, I think, the place where people get the deepest kind of formation that allows them to go back to their school and start thinking intentionally about how to bring faith and science together across the
And are
curriculum.
those on campus at Notre Dame? Those last one?
Well, we do one on campus at Notre Dame,
Okay.
and then we do one in New Orleans. I'm from New Orleans, and when I started as an outside collaborator, they asked me in that capacity to develop a seminar. So we still go back there, and then also we're doing one a diocesan kind of one for the Diocese of Lansing, so that we can work with lots of teachers. Usually we can only take like 3 to 6 from each school, but in this case, we'll be able to take many more. And that's this summer. So we don't have a seminar this coming summer that's open to everyone, but we've been invited to write another proposal for another 3 years. So we're very hopeful that we'll be doing seminars well into the future.
Fantastic. Well, it's great to have a fellow worker in the vineyard. My own
Thank
experience
you.
of this is like the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few. I mean, everywhere I go, Catholic schools want to be doing this, and they're calling out for resources, for formation, all this kind of stuff. And so, another thing I want to do in this community is bring the people who are doing that work together and expose, our one another to each other's audiences, because I find that there's people that they just want more. I go speak somewhere and they say, okay, who do we get next year? Because we want to keep this
Right.
going. Right. So, there's just plenty of work to be done. And it's so great to hear about the work that you and your whole team at McGrath are doing. And like I said earlier, we should certainly have you back. Cause I think you and we could go on for much longer than recommended length for this kind of show is. So, thanks
Absolutely.
again for being with us. And we're going to sign off for the regular podcast and take our questions from our community here in just a second. God bless everyone.
God bless everyone.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's podcast, I want to tell you about the Making Every Class Catholic online community. There, you'll have access to regular live interactions with me and with plenty of great presenters in presentations, workshops, and Q&A, as well as to a network of committed Catholic educators and a growing library of resources. And be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most important of all, share this with a fellow Catholic educator. We've got more exciting guests lined up in the months to come. You won't want to miss them. Until then, God bless you in your work, making every class Catholic.